Hello and welcome to Dual Citizens. My name is David Ould.
And my name is Stephen McAlpine. And today we're speaking with author Aaron Renn about his recent book, Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in an Anti-Christian Culture. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's great to have you from, I think we're all in different time zones in different parts of the world, but some commonalities about what we're talking about. So, Aaron, tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with and your journey towards analysing the church and the culture that comes across in your book.
Sure. Well, obviously, I am an American, and I'm from the Middle West. I was raised in rural Indiana, grew up in a Assemblies of God church there. It was very culture war, end times, all of that stuff from like the late 1970s into the 1980s. After university, I moved to Chicago and embarked on three separate careers, basically. So career number one was management consulting, predominantly with Accenture, which I was with for about 15 years. Then I did a pivot in my work and started writing about urban policy. Somebody said, Aaron, you love cities like only somebody from a town of fewer than 100 people can. I got very fascinated by cities when I moved to Chicago, and I actually decided to start writing about cities and ended up in New York City, in Manhattan at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, which is a think tank there. And then I pivoted again to start writing more focused on the future of evangelicalism and especially men's issues. I actually got interested in this when I saw that this was about a decade ago, before anyone had heard of Jordan Peterson. In fact, I didn't even know who he was. But I saw young men turning to online influencers and not to the church. And I said, wow, why is that? And if anything, that delta between the church and these influencers has only exploded, as now there's numerous of these guys that have enormous followings, but not the church. And so it just went from there. And I just started applying essentially my policy analysis / consulting skill set to the problem of the church. And that's kind of how I ended up doing this stuff. And then also along the way, I sort of did, if you will, a denominational pivot. So I'm now a Presbyterian. And so I grew up in the book in what you might call a culture war environment, and lived as an adult in the city, largely in what I call a cultural engagement environment.
That's a big difference. And the Hal Lindsey and the Chick publications of the 70s and 80s, big pivot to the culture wars were still back there, and here they are again.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, that trend has continued on, of course.
Presbyterian's almost Anglican as far as I'm concerned, Aaron. We'll get you there eventually into the true the true church. Read the book, loved it. Here's the copy that I've been reading. Many of our listeners, readers will have read it. Some won't have. Why don't you give us just a very brief overview of what you do in the book, sort of the analysis you do, and then the move to application in it?
Sure. So the book is really two things. The first quarter of the book is sort of a cultural diagnostic, looking at how the culture, kind of a secular culture, at least secular culture in the United States, has changed in its perception of Christianity over the last 60 years, and in how the church responded to that. The last three quarters of it is basically, okay, how should we live in response? And so it is, I will confess, very American-focused analysis. And in fact, I am basically explicitly said I'm not trying to give any international examples here, although I think it's relevant to the international market. And I'm very glad I didn't try to do stuff on international, because the one time I said anything international, I made a mistake about Australia, where I said that guy who got fired from that sporting club after one day was actually taking over a president of a soccer team, and yes. I'm informed it's actually Australian rules football, which is a major error. So I'm glad that's all I said about Australia in the book. So I gotta go ahead and just put my own error on the table, which I'm going to get that corrected in the next printing.
Yeah.
But it is really focused on America, and of course the dates and things. And so the first again, the quarter of it is really an expansion of an article I wrote in First Things magazine in 2022 that was a huge viral hit for them, where I talked about what I call the three worlds of evangelicalism. And briefly, in the United States, we never had an established church. We never had a state church. But for most of our history, we did have a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So in 1950s America, half of all adults attended church every week. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools, in our government schools. We were adding "in God we trust" to our money. A lot of things were like that were happening. In the 1960s, this starts to become unraveled. Christianity goes into decline in America, and it's a decline that continues to the present day. And I really divide that period of decline from, say, 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world is 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear about something. The positive world is a period of decline for Christianity. All is not well in this time period. Nevertheless, Christianity is still viewed positively. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society. Christian moral norms are still the basic moral norms of society, and if you violate them, you could get into trouble. Around 1994, we hit a tipping point, however, and enter what I call the neutral world, which lasts from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. So we might meet. I say, I'm a Christian. You'd say, great, I'm a vegan. Let's talk. Let's sit down and have a conversation. And Christian morality had a certain residual effect. Then in 2014, we had a second tipping point and enter what I call the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of the United States, official elite culture views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated, and in fact, in some respects, traditional Christianity is viewed as the leading threat to the new public moral order. And this has been very dislocating to American evangelicals, to say the least.
I wonder if I can just ask a follow-up on that, because one of the things that some of the critics of that way of analyzing might say is they don't see that positive position prior to 1994. So just as two examples, Christians who stood up against slavery, even in the 19th century, let alone not the racism stuff in the 60s, they were opposed by the wider society. Abortion, the shift on that, even in the 1970s. So for those people who would go, well, hang on a minute, it wasn't even positive then. How can you call it positive? How do you respond to that challenge?
Well, when it goes in, I think we get back into the past. The key is not that every individual experienced positive outcomes. Okay, so I would say that. I would just say it's the general pattern of life. I think, I give a good example of, from the positive world, there was a political scandal in the United States in 1987 when a politician who was the leading candidate for president the next year was forced to drop out of the race after it was reported he'd had an affair. I mean, that's an example of what it means to live in a positive world, where the Christian moral standard is still the standard kind of society, if you will, and those sorts of things. And you look at, you also got another thing that I think some people try to confuse is they try to say that, I've experienced some negative outcome, or I'm experiencing some kind of pain, and therefore I'm in a negative world. I'm referring to here specifically how society views Christianity. So one of the complaints would be, if you go back, people would say, well, it wasn't a positive world for Black Americans. And that would have been true certainly in much of American past. But it's very clear they were not being discriminated against because they were Christian. They were being discriminated against because they were Black. Their discrimination was not going to go away if they renounced their faith or even publicly attacked, Christianity or became a Muslim or something. So they weren't having. And even the civil rights movement, was sort of appealing to the Christian moral system of America to justify their positions. And of course, the abolitionists, back in the slave era were doing the same thing. They were sort of making Christian arguments here. And of course, there were, Christian arguments on both sides. The Southern slave owners would point to the Bible and say they were having their verses. But in essence, part of it was a debate on which the basis was theology, which would never be the case today. And I think there are always individual cases, that are exceptions, that kind of prove the rule. So I always say and stress that American Christians are not being persecuted today. I don't believe what's happening to American Christians should be called persecution, particularly when you see, Christians in China are getting locked up for real by the government, for having church, or people in Nigeria or in India are being victims of sectarian violence. We're not experiencing anything like that. However, I think there are probably isolated individuals who have a claim to say they were persecuted. I don't know the gentleman's name, but the guy that owns Masterpiece Cake Shop Bakery in Colorado, the governments have repeatedly gone after him legally because he refuses to make certain cakes. And it's gone to the U.S. Supreme Court, but they still keep coming after him. And very clearly, he is being singled out and persecuted because he's a Christian. So I would say that's a form of persecution, but that's an individual case that doesn't invalidate, I think, the rule. And other people, another thing that I say today too, and this gets to some of those past examples, when you engage in civil disobedience and suffer a consequence for, engaging in civil disobedience, that's kind of the nature of the beast. You're deliberately violating the law or something in order to make a point. And so you can't, when you're deliberately transgressing something, I don't think you can really call that persecution. Because, you're the one that's sort of instigating this. You're not just sitting there minding your own business and one day they broke into your house and came and locked you up. And that doesn't make it, of course, right that they locked you up necessarily. But what it does say is it's categorically different, I think, from just people who are minding their own business getting. So there's a lot of things I think we could talk about, with regards to that. But again, when there's prayer and, Bible reading in the public schools in the 1950s, and then you look at what's in the schools today, I think we can see that there's been quite a sea change in the culture, however you want to label it. Yeah.
Look, in terms of the church, so what I, appreciating about your book is that you're coming from a fresh perspective outside of the church. And I know a couple of years ago when you were writing for First Things and you had James Wood responding to these issues as well, one of the words that we heard a lot in the neutral world was we've got to become winsome in evangelical circles to describe our stance towards, or almost a strategy towards the world, as if somehow to gain a hearing. Do you think that's failed? And does it risk sort of bifurcating evangelism in the church setting, that we're somehow to be winsome there from how life in the public square is where there's so much hostility? Is that winsome word past its use-by date, do you think?
Yeah, I kind of regret I used the word once in the book, I think. I don't really talk about winsomeness all that much. I think it's a little bit of a red herring, and because it sort of confuses more than it clarifies. Because I think there is a sense in which some of the strategies that were sort of, we'll have when they go to the heading of winsome, I think are obsolete. But when you say that, people's takeaway from that is, well, of course, we should be obnoxious jerks in public and just, which is not the case either. I think being winsomeness kind of well understood, I think is something we should seek to have, as a general disposition of life, quite apart from, whether or not it's part of some super effective ministry strategy. I don't want to be this boorish, obnoxious person. And unfortunately, a lot of people seem to thrive on that. I think if you look at, but I think you can say you can be winsome and yet be very clear on where you disagree with key points on sort of the secular orthodoxy. And I think the guy who really displayed winsomeness that I'm talking about was Jordan Peterson in his famous Channel 4 interview from 2018, where he's got this very hostile female interviewer, and he's just calmly sitting there stating his points, and this isn't an exact quote, okay, but he's saying something like, I'm sorry, but actually women and men are different on these psychological traits. Women are on average higher in agreeableness. That has consequences for this, that, and the other thing. He's just saying this is the case, and it's factual, and it's there, and it's rooted in science, in peer-reviewed literature, and his, legitimate authority as a professor. He's not backing down. He's being clear about where he disagrees, but he's also, not being the bomb thrower, and he's just sitting there. So I think that's kind of a little bit that's something I think we can look at and say, because I think what had happened was in the winsome dialogue in the church, winsome became, and it basically translated means don't say anything unpopular. And that is not what winsomeness means.
Well, can I follow up on that? Because Peterson clearly knows that he's living in a negative world. He might describe it a bit differently to the way that we do, but he's very clear on that. That interview is a good example. And as you say, some Christians have just gone, it's all negative. It's World War III. Let's go into it. And yet, the winsomeness thing often has been from some people who it's almost like we're reluctant to admit that we are now living in that negative world, because perhaps of what it might mean for us, or we might actually have to shift our understanding of how things are. Do you think that's the case, that for some of us, we can't admit that we're in that negative world now? And if so, why might that be?
Yeah, I think there were, a lot of people who did, maybe build an approach that was built on this, quote unquote, winsomeness strategy. That definitely the entry into the negative world is a fundamental challenge to that model, because, you're not going to have the sorts of opportunities to engage that you thought. I didn't put this in the book, but one of the things I would put as an example of the cultural engagement model from the neutral world, I think, was the emerging church movement. Yep. And I'm reading an academic book about the emerging church right now, and a lot of the examples they're giving, meetings in pubs where all these people who disagreed on all these big topics would get together and dialogue. In fact, I even think they called it the emerging church conversation a lot. And it was like this idea that we're all just going to have this dialogue together, and we're going to be non-judgmental. And that's just not how the world works today. No. If you are like 1 millimeter out of line of this, ideology or whatever, you get zapped by these people over here. And so it's just a different world. And so those sorts of ideas, it was like, we'll just get together in a pub and have a sort of, freewheeling conversation about things like, wow, you probably wouldn't even think about doing that today. At least not in the same way, because it's just going to have different results. So I think it is, I do think that there's that. And so I do, I don't think they're now saying, I'm not hearing a lot of people say today that we're not in a negative world. But what they are saying is not totally true. Again, not totally clear. A lot of the, a lot of what I see from some of these people is, and again, you can't put everybody in the same category as deep hostility towards the religious right and people that vote for Donald Trump. And like a great example of this would be a guy named Tim Alberta. He's a reporter for The Atlantic magazine, which is a prestigious secular publication. I think it's the oldest magazine in the United States. It's owned apparently by Steve Jobs' widow, and lots of people write for it. I've written for it a few times, actually. And he's, written a book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, basically savaging evangelicals that voted for Trump. And of course, he's been feted, by society. And I read the book, and the truth is, when I read his criticisms of many of the people he criticizes in the book, the criticisms are valid. A lot of these people are just kooky and over the top and clearly way out of line. But in his hundreds of pages in this book, he never once says anything or says that Christianity requires anything that's going to get him in trouble with the average Atlantic reader. He's sort of giving them the red meat that they want about how awful these Trump voters are, while talking about how he is an evangelical and he's the son of an evangelical pastor and all of this stuff. And so that is sort of a sort of the template for a little bit of what I see is people like that. And I would put him in the cultural engagement camp because, again, he moved back to Michigan, but I think he was living in D.C. He works for a prestigious secular publication in journalism. That's like the paradigm of that cultural engagement model. But that's what he's up to. And I think that's something that I see much more of. The guns are trained, but their guns are active, but they're trained internally to the church. But of course, they're getting as well as they're giving too. It's not like the culture war people are, believe me, they're firing back, with equal as much power as they can muster.
Yeah. Look, if you turn to what you're talking about, the media in the Times of London today, James Marriott writing an article about how the new generation, millennials, are starting to look for religion again in a way that the boomers and the X-gen had sort of said, well, that's done. And it seems that transcendence is on the comeback. And, two of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse are currently dead, and two others have sort of rolled over a little bit. How do you see Christianity's future playing out in the negative world in terms of it having a renaissance? And what might that look like in a negative world?
Yeah. Again, I can't predict the future. And so I don't like to and one of the things that you'll see about the things that I lay out in the book, and I talk about, we need to adopt this posture of exploration. We don't have certainty. We need to be comfortable in the unknowns. And I try to lay out ideas that are not predicated on a particular outcome in the future coming true. Because if there's one thing we know, the world is crazier than we ever thought. We keep seeing that every day. Again, who thought 2015 Donald Trump is going to be the next president? Who thought December 2019 we're going to have this worldwide pandemic for the next 2 years, which, affected you guys? You had one of the worst lockdowns in the world, right? Australia, harshest lockdowns in the world. Oh, now there's an invasion of Ukraine. Oh, now the Middle East is erupting and stuff again. So we don't know what's going to happen. So that I think is important. But I do think it's important to resist the doom and gloom that's out there. I think there's this idea that a lot of people have, ultra pessimistic, that Christianity is kind of having a going out of business sale in the West. And I don't see that happening. I think Christianity is going to be around and sizable for an extended period of time in the United States. I think it will be smaller. I think we're going through a period of, obviously transition and turmoil. But I don't think it's a simple matter that it's going to go away. And, in Rod Dreher's book, I think it was The Benedict Option, he talked about how he would go over to France, where very few people go to church in France. And he would talk about these young 20-something, 30-something Catholics, traditionalist Catholics, that were like all fired up. They're like, hey, we're here. We're serious. This is great. And you see it. There's been some interesting, I think Gen Z, there are people who are Christian in Gen Z. They don't remember like the glory days of, Ronald Reagan's America or like any stuff like that. They've kind of come into a little bit of a pre-collapsed world socially. And you always hear all these terrible things about, Generation Z and their mental health issues and all that stuff. And there's a lot of that that's true, but there's a lot of that that's, I think, missing the great things that are happening in that generation. And I just did a post on my website, aaronrenn.com, go and sign up, called Why I'm Bullish on Generation Z. And like there's this young guy in America, he goes under the name Redeemed Zoomer, and his plan is to retake mainline denominations for Orthodox Christianity. And he's even got like a Discord server with like 1,000+ people on it. They've got active plans on these denominations. Again, I think that's probably not going to happen. Let's be honest, but I love the ambition. I love the positivity. I love the can-do spirit. And he's not just talking, he's like actually organizing. They're trying to do something. They're thinking about it. He's like, these are our churches. We're not walking away. And, this campus pastor guy just wrote to me and said, the Gen Z guys on the college Christians, man, they're like wearing Christian t-shirts around. They're out and proud. Like we would never have done that when I was in college, So it is different. And I just saw an interesting study. Again, this was just one article, so you know how seriously to take it in Finland, where they talk about an uptick in church attendance among young men. And so you never know. I think it's going to be interesting things that are happening. And, I think the fact that people like Jordan Peterson remain so popular and these gurus remain so popular, it tells you people are looking for something. Mm-hmm. They're looking for somebody to give them like the straight dope that they think that our world is not really giving it to them straight. They see some problems that aren't being acknowledged. They don't think they're getting told the truth by mainstream culture, which in fact they are being lied to by mainstream culture. And yeah, our leaders are terrible and all of that stuff. And they're looking for people to give them truth, and they're looking for people to be their sage in life. It's amazing. Jordan Peterson, one of his early things was his Genesis lectures. Then he did some stuff on Exodus. He's compiling them into a book called We Who Wrestle with God. And the book's not out, but he's doing a tour of the U.S. And I went and saw him in Indianapolis, where I live. 2,500 seat theater sold out at over $100, like $100 minimum to get in the place. You're basically paying that kind of money and up to hear Jordan Peterson preach a sermon on Genesis 12. I'm like, it's amazing. Like, we can't get people to show up, these young people to show up at church. They're like, look at all these people who are coming there. So I think that shows that there is like an enormous demand. And yeah, I think you're right. There is this whole idea of re-enchantment is coming back. Rod Dreher has a gift of putting his finger on what's coming next. He's right. His next book is going to be on re-enchantment, and we definitely see it. I think we see it in the Christian space, in the whole pivot to Eastern Orthodoxy. You hear a lot of people talking about that. We see it in the world, like all these people like talking about astrology again. I mean, I thought astrology went away. Now people are talking about astrology. They're talking about all this stuff. It's, people who are going on these ayahuasca trips and taking all their psychedelics to try to get in touch with the spirit realm. This is going to be a big spirituality re-enchantment. I think it's coming along. People are experiencing the impoverishment of the present age. So I think there's reasons. I think there are trends in the world that give us optimism for evangelization, and that certainly some people are going to be there. And so there's going to be some core group of people, how big, I don't know, that I think are going to be very enthusiastic Christians, maybe even like harder core in a way than, the boomers were.
Aaron, we can't talk to an American evangelical without talking about Trump. It just has to be done, I'm afraid. He's the black hole that everything circulates around. You do mention him in your book. I mean, you just mentioned him here in our interview. He's just this asteroid that arrived, and had this enormous impact. Or maybe he's just filled a vacuum in the way that Peterson. We've talked about filling a vacuum. Either way, there he is. What impact has the arrival of Trump and the Trump phenomena had for evangelicals? Give us a brief little summary of that. How have you watched evangelicals respond to it in various ways? And I think more importantly, how do we learn? How do we learn from that? How do we learn from that?
Well, that's a great question. What I would say is, we've had a lot, as I intimated, we've had a lot of intra-evangelical conflict and realignment. And I think there have basically been two major events that have sort of polarized evangelicals. One is Donald Trump phenomenon, Donald Trump. The second is wokeness. There's really kind of a big, hard turn towards racial issues. I actually started researching it back in 2017 because I noticed that like every other article I'd see on some of these sites was about race, and it was turbocharged by the BLM movement. And so those two things really started causing a lot of intra-evangelical conflict. And then, of course, you label on top of that COVID. And, we shut down, not shut down, all of that. COVID did a massive resorting of people between churches. So people would change churches just because their church wasn't meeting and somebody else's church was meeting. And it was one of these things, like, I'd hate to have been a pastor during that, because you're going to be hearing it no matter what you do. It's like a no-win situation. It's tough to be a pastor today. And Trump is definitely one of them. And I think Trump is a product of the negative world in this sense. that even in a positive or a neutral world, it would have been impossible for someone like him to become president. So something that's rarely discussed with regards to Trump is the fact that he was, one of the things that made him famous was his ownership of casinos in Atlantic City. And if you go back to like the 80s and the 90s when he was in the casino business, gambling was basically not legal in the United States. It was legal in Vegas, and Atlantic City, I think, may have only legalized gambling in the 1980s. It wasn't legal that long even there. And, states had lotteries and that, but, gambling was still basically viewed as a vice. It was viewed negatively in the country. And, to gamble, you either had to go to your local mob bookmaker, or you flew to Vegas and gambled at a casino that was also controlled by the mob. So basically, gambling was kind of perceived as a mobbed up business. It was a seedy business. It was a mobbed up business. It was a vice. It was not something legitimate people would be involved in, basically. And so, Playboy magazine used to make all of its money from casinos that it owned. They were in the casino. That's who you expected to be in the casino business. People like that. So the fact that Donald Trump was a casino guy, like he would not have gotten elected just for that reason alone. And, now that we can actually do betting, you can bet on the National Football League on your phone during the game. The leagues are partners in it. Famous sporting figures are pitchmen for gambling. It's a completely different era in America. All of the moral standards that used to govern society are now gone in a negative world. And so one of the things that is, I think an irony of that is all of these standards would have previously prohibited someone like a Donald Trump from getting elected. And now they're all gone. So you can't say, well, he was, he had all these affairs. He was involved in all this shady stuff. Well, yeah, but you say all that stuff's okay now. You're basically say free love is great. So, you can't say, oh, he's crude in his language. Vulgarity saturates our culture now. It's perfectly acceptable to be vulgar, to you. So it's like the standards are gone. And, Donald Trump talked about running for president for like 30 years. He just didn't do it. He had this fictive reform party thing that was going on, but it wasn't serious because I think he knew I can't get elected president. But he saw in 2015 that the world was different. And he said, I'm coming down that escalator and I'm going to win. And of course, it's really polarized evangelicals, and people have lost their mind over Trump in both camps. I would tell you. I mean, the people who hate him, the minority of them that didn't vote for him, it's just all they do is just every day. It's like another David French column, and then he's now a New York Times columnist, heaping regular denunciations on it. But the other side has some issues too. So one of the things in Tim Alberta's book that he mentions, his father had been a pastor and his father passed away not too many, recently. And, he goes back to his father's church, and at the funeral, he had written some negative articles about Trump and a book about Trump. At the funeral, people are coming up to him, giving him grief over not being a Trump supporter, questioning whether he's really a Christian. Like at his father's funeral, they can't let it drop for like 1 minute. And so I do think when it comes to Trump, people just lost their minds, and the truth is, yeah, Donald Trump is an unusual figure. He's not going to be the norm in our politics. But, the kinds of things that Trump does, I mean, this is what our society is like today. And he may have an exaggerated form of it, but we're not going to have quote unquote morality in politics anymore. We're not going to have it. And that's why, I'll give you one more example before we move on. There's this woman, she's a Republican. She's a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Her name is Nancy Mace. She's a self-described evangelical. She spoke at this prayer breakfast, and she gets there, and she makes a joke about, I'm sorry that I'm late. This isn't the direct quote, but it's something to this effect. My boyfriend wanted to have sex with me this morning, but I said, no, not now. I got to get ready and go to the prayer breakfast. So she's basically cohabitating with this guy, having sex with him, and she's just openly saying this at the prayer breakfast, And it never occurred to her that this might be an inappropriate thing to say. So there you go.
That is a big one. Yeah, look, we're coming to a bit of an end, but I want to ask a question of so much of what Rod Dreher says and what are we thinking is how do we raise up new institutions, but that can flourish and show something different to the world, and perhaps because they've been so captured, our institutions, but how do you get new institutions off the ground that have any meaningful teeth to them if the regulatory and legislative climate is hostile to their flourishing? So I'm thinking like Western University in Canada, which was it was the peak bodies of the law firms in Canada that said, you can give any degree you like to any student you want, but we won't recognize that qualification because of your discrimination laws. How do you move forward in a negative world to set up new institutions?
That's a great question. Here's what I'd say. I think we need to question whether we should have an institution at some point. There's a famous book in the United States called Seeing Like a State. And it was written by kind of a libertarian guy. And one of the things that this guy points out is that one of the core things that states like to do is make things legible so that they could administer and tax and control. So he talks about, how in medieval Europe, tenure land rights were all governed by custom. There weren't even like deeds or documents. It was all custom. And over time, they imposed, the central governments imposed land registries and standardized rights and deeds and all of this stuff that became, very, very uniform. It made it legible to the central government. And of course, legibility means you could be taxed. And so I really think a lot about this legibility idea. When you create an institution that has legal personality, it's legible. And so what I see, and this is happening organically, is people are doing things that are intentionally informal. So in the United States, it's technically legal to have an all males members club. But, if you have one, you might get attacked by the New York Times. If you're a member of it, you're probably going to get attacked for being a member of it. You're going to get in trouble. This has been going on in London right now. One of the old Garrick or one of their old gentlemen's clubs. And, some paper got a hold of their membership list. And they want to, admit women, so they're on a jihad. So what people are doing now, they have a group of friends, which is the basis of a club. They have like an annual guys weekend. They have little events. They do these things, but it's not an actual organization. It's just a group of friends. Yeah. So it's so you go to China, like a lot of house churches. We don't have a building. We don't have a, 501c3 or whatever equivalent is. We're just a group of people that meet in a home. And so I think, there's also a book. I haven't read the actual book, but I've seen a lot of his ideas. Balaji Srinivasan, The Network State. The idea is he's very into blockchain. And I say maybe we should have quote unquote blockchain institutions. Not in a literal sense. Blockchain is very legible, but the idea is it's something that's not part of the formal system. And with something like, okay, I want to become a lawyer, you got to have a law degree. That's a hard problem to crack. It's a hard nut to crack. But saying, how can we do things that do not involve formal institutions? Because part of it is, when it is kind of a negative world, when it's a hostile culture, you got to keep your head down a little bit. You can't, maybe you got to hide out. Some people, they did hide out in the catacombs for a while. They didn't want to stay there. Wasn't but sometimes they did. So I'm not like a head for the hills guy, but at the same time, we got to take stock of the world. So I think thinking about, do we need to create a new institution? Or we need to think about alternative structures to formal institutions as they have been traditionally understood in the West. That is, to me, my view, one of the key to-dos.
Aaron, we are almost out of time. I just want to ask you one more question that possibly you're not going to get asked by interviewers in the United States. Now, you very wisely said, I'm not going to try and analyze culture outside of America. You had one failed attempt at discussing football here in Australia. Good luck to you. But I suspect we're just as bad with American culture as well, despite the amount in which what goes on in American evangelicalism influences what goes on in evangelicalism all around the world. I mean, I think we effectively imported some of your arguments over COVID into our own Australian ecosystem. and foolishly didn't contextualize what was going on. That's a debate for another day. But here's my question for you, just briefly at the end. What's one thing about evangelicalism in America itself that you think non-Americans probably really need to get their head around as we watch you guys go through your culture war, you guys face your negative world, and we try and learn from that? What's one thing we need to know about you guys that maybe we've not quite got our head around?
One thing about evangelicalism in America is that it is sort of a middle-class movement. So again, having never had a state church or a formal church, Protestantism in the United States historically was deeply stratified racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. And so the different churches were associated with different sort of classes in society. And there's various versions of this, but there's kind of a quip that goes, the average American starts off as the son of a Baptist farmer. You know, he becomes a Methodist when he gets his first white-collar job. He becomes a Presbyterian when he gets his first promotion, and he becomes an Episcopalian when he makes it to the C-suite. And so what would happen is you'd sort of move up in life. You would change denominations, perhaps, as you moved up in society. And so, the Episcopalians, which would be, the Anglican Church, and the Presbyterians were the elites of Protestantism. The political elites, the business elites, the social elites, the intellectual elites were part of these denominations. And, those denominations, by and large, embraced liberal theology. And it became, originally it was not the case. There was sort of a lot of flow back and forth between evangelicalism and those what were called mainline denominations, the major traditional Protestant denominations like, Episcopalian and Presbyterianism. But now there's more of a hard boundary between them. And so we got cut off from our elites. And it's not, my impression is, for example, like in England, that evangelicalism is a movement within the Church of England, and so it's still connected institutionally to, the church, and, its intellectuals in that are part of that, movement, such as it is. Whereas, in America, we don't have that. So there was a book written about 30 years ago called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. The scandal being that evangelicals don't seem to have a mind. And that is a big artifact, and I talk about this in the book. It's an artifact of us being cut off from our own elites. So basically, evangelicalism really lacks an elite class. The leadership class of evangelicalism are really not elites. They're sort of like, a higher grade of proletariat. They're like high prol type people. They're not genuine elites. They're not like superpower intellects. They're not great institutional leaders in society outside of that. And we suffer a lot from that. And I don't know the landscape in Australia, but I think in some other countries, there's more institutional connectivity to established elite institutions that creates different dynamics.
Yeah. Look, that's an intriguing difference, and one I think that we'll think about in future episodes, because this is called dual citizens, and obviously we're citizens of Australia, but we catch a little bit of the cold when America sneezes culturally. We definitely get that. Yeah,
that's what it means. We're kind of cultural imperialists. All the Europeans are mad that we're exporting wokeness, and they're doing all these crazy things. And it's like that has nothing to do with us. And again, our cultural and our legal traditions are quite different in the United States. And and we're very ornery people. There's a very strong folk libertarian, what I call get off my lawn libertarianism. There's a little bit of that in the culture. It's a little bit like, we kind of like being, disagreeable by nature sometimes when people want to tell us what to do. Well, I'm not going to let you do that on principle.
Well, Aaron, yeah, you've been most agreeable, actually, so you're countercultural. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much for the book, Life in the Negative World. It was an inspirational book in many respects because of how positive it was. I'll say that. So we appreciate that you wrote it. We thank you for taking your time to come on air and speak with us today, Aaron Renn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for being with us on Dual Citizens. If you like what you're seeing and hearing, if it's helpful for you, please do subscribe on the socials, on your podcast, and tell your friends about us.